Our New Testament reading for this morning comes from Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. Listen now for what the Spirit is saying to the church. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, "Let Jesus be cursed." And no one can say, "Jesus is Lord," except by the Holy Spirit. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the discernment of spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you know much about school systems, you know that some children in school are labeled gifted. Now, I imagine that most all parents like to think that their particular child is gifted in some way, but schools use this term a little more narrowly to refer to those with special talents in academic or certain creative areas. The same sort of things that will get you into a good college, and the same sorts of things that often lead to a high-paid job. We don't really value all gifts equally. Some are better than others. We think there's a hierarchy of gifts, and some impress us more than others do. Even at church, you can see this at work. Pastors who are deemed to have gifts in preaching and being a CEO make a lot more money than those whose gifts are in the areas of, say, pastoral care. Now, I don't know that it's inherently wrong for somebody to make more money than somebody else, but there is a tendency for us to view those who make more money, those who have the better gifts, as somehow inherently better individuals, as people who are worth more. Now, it's funny the things you remember from when you were growing up. So one of those random things that I recall from my elementary school days was a short story that I read. A story about a little boy who was embarrassed by his father. His father was a mechanic who worked in some sort of shop. The father's hands were rough and perpetually stained, and he didn't wear nice clothes like the other boys' fathers did. And the boy never talked about his father at school, and when the school announced that there was going to be a grand end-of-the-year outing at a park on a nearby lake, the boy prayed that his father wouldn't be able to get off work and come. But of course, his father did get off work and did attend the outing, but in the world of third-grade short stories, the father became the hero as he was able to repair the boat, which had broken down far from shore right as the giant storm was about to hit. And of course now the little boy is proud of his father, the hero. If only life always worked like that. But of course it doesn't, and so kids at school tend to make fun of the one that they deem slow or the one they deem different, and people look down on those who they think have less impressive gifts, gifts that are worth less. Actually, in practical terms, we really don't think of some as having better gifts than others. We think more in terms of some being gifted and some not having gifts. Some are gifted, some are not. And so people Some people are important. Some people are indispensable. And despite how unbiblical such talk is, you see that going on in the church. Pastors are often thought of as the only ones with real calls. They're the ones who have the indispensable gifts on which the congregation rises or falls. And pastors sometimes secretly love to hear this, that they're the ones that nothing important happens without us. But in truth, such thinking burns out pastors and it cripples congregations. It breeds members who think that they can't do anything important. And I often hear pastors complain about members who say, oh, I could never teach a class, or oh, I could never start a new ministry, or I could never share my faith. And sometimes this is people realizing their limitations, but more often it is people buying into the idea that they're not the one with the gifts. Sometimes people also think of spirituality the same way. They say, oh, she's so spiritual, and I can't help but hear a little echo in there of, but I'm not. Some folks are gifted, some are not. Some folks are spiritual, some are not. And that brings me back to Paul's letter to the church of Corinth. The verses that we heard this morning open with Paul writing, now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. Actually, Paul writes, now concerning spiritual things. Because Paul later goes on to speak of gifts, a lot of translators assume gifts are the things that he is talking about, but I'm not sure but what would be better to just leave Paul saying what he actually said. Let him be addressing all things spiritual. Paul's a long-distance pastor to the church at Corinth. And though he loved his congregation dearly, they were a source of great frustration to him. He has just concluded trying to straighten them out on the wrong ways that they do the Lord's Supper. He's worried about divisions there, and among all the other problems that they have, it seems that the Corinthians tended to think of faith and spirituality a lot like we think of gifts. Some had it and some didn't. Some gifts were indispensable and some were unimportant. And for some reason, the Corinthian church especially liked those ecstatic gifts. And so they were really impressed with people who saw visions, or especially people who spoke in tongues. People like that were deemed big-time people of faith, while run-of-the-mill members of their church were thought of as inferior and unimportant. And Paul will have none of this. Spirituality is not something that some have and others don't, he says. No one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. Now, Jesus is Lord was the basic faith statement of the early Christian movement. And Paul is saying that all who come to faith, all who come to trust in Jesus, do so because the Holy Spirit dwells in them. The Spirit is not restricted to a few, but the Spirit is at work in the lives of all the faithful.